Well, Foreign Minister Penny Wong has expressed her concerns over China's surging military capabilities ahead of the Prime Minister's trip to Beijing this weekend. The senator, who's in Malaysia attending the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, claims China's lack of transparency about nuclear and conventional military build-up is becoming more concerning. Late to the program here. Well, she says President Donald Trump's Indo-Pacific policies to counterweight China are necessary.
A lot of a discussion with our friends in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, about the importance of us working together. And I talked about the importance of a region where no country dominates and no country is dominated. A region where, as I described it, there is a balance of power, which of course requires continued US engagement.
Well, there is one country that dominates. Anthony Albanese will be spending 6 days in China, where he'll meet President Xi Jinping. That leads us to former DFAT China Council scholar Andrew Phelan, China watcher as well. Andrew, interesting comments from the Foreign Minister there, all ahead of this trip. How much can be read into that?
A lot, Peter. I think it's very interesting that she's made them at the 11th hour, as it were. Wang Yi, China's Foreign Minister, is also at that meeting, and he's been talking up China as as an example of free trade and global order. In actual fact, there's this impression in Australia that, Trump's the big bad wolf as far as tariff goes. But the truth of the matter is all these markets in Asia, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, they've all used high degrees of protection really since World War II, through the Cold War, through, the Korean War, the Vietnam War. And the US has largely turned a blind eye to that. For Cold War reasons. And today Trump's saying, look, China used tariff and non-tariff protection while it was building its auto industry, and they've had free access to the US market. And now, he's saying enough already. We should be able to compete on an equal reciprocal basis. So the Albanese visit's coming at the end of a 30-year era where the US and China have had this mutually convenient symbiotic relationship. And that worked well until it didn't. And now is that time, and we're seeing a separation of the two. So it's a real turning point in history. And I'm not sure the Prime Minister fully appreciates the strategic depth of what's happening at the moment.
Let's go to the transaction that's usually involved with a meeting like this, Andrew. So what does China want out of this?
Yeah, well, China's, I think, played Albanese very well, and I think he's been a little naive. The standard line is we've stabilised the relationship with our patient and nuanced approach and so on. I don't see it that way at all. In fact, I think that narrative needs to be retired. Remember, China unilaterally coerced Australia after the COVID pandemic, and at the time Albanese said, our request for an inquiry into COVID was unremarkable. It's China that's let those various trade bans lapse. And I think they've done that unilaterally, and they've got a relatively compliant Australia out of it. We saw interventions by the ambassador cautioning us against lifting our defence spend. At the moment, we can't even maintain a small naval fleet adequately. So I think we're in a crisis.
So what is... sorry. So what will China want out of us for this trip then, if they're already pretty hunky-dory with things?
Yeah. Well, the Prime Minister hasn't really explained the purpose and timing of this trip to the Australian public very well. And I think that's a conversation that he's got to have and be honest with the Australian people, because Penny Wong's absolutely right. The size, speed and scale of China's military build-up is incredibly concerning. Last week in Europe, we had Wang Yi make a very uncharacteristic admission that China had Russia's back in the war over Ukraine. We knew that already, but to hear it from him was highly unusual. And so I think China's going to be asking, leave the Port of Darwin alone. Their number one strategic objective is to distance us from our ally strategic relationship with the US. That remains the case. So, they'll be trying to exert as much pressure as they can. And one thing we don't talk about is the goods we import from China. We don't talk about Shein. We don't talk about Temu.
Yeah.
We don't talk about the flood of internet-connected vehicles and other aspects of the energy grid where the software is going to be written in China. So it's all sort of one-way traffic in terms of our export.
So
we don't talk about imports.
Okay, so with that said, from their side of things, what do you think we would get out of this meeting? I mean, if you say the Prime Minister's naive, are we going to get anything out of this, or is it just one of those grip and grin, smile for the cameras, and everyone goes home afterwards?
Yeah, I don't see a lot of substance coming out of some of these meetings. For instance, the visit to Jakarta en route to the Pope's funeral and so on. And because he hasn't really laid out an agenda, it's hard to say what the big takeaway for Australia is. Certainly, China will be lobbying for more access, FDI access to critical minerals and rare earths. The Treasurer's made clear that he's not going to relent in that space. So it's hard to say, what China really wants to get out of this, or for that matter, what Australia's going to get out of it, other than continuity. He's got the miners and the banks going with him in sales of iron ore first and foremost. And demand for iron ore at some point in the future has got to taper off. So, we're really entering a new era here. And, although this trip is very anticipated, I don't really see the objective and the expected outcome from it.
Okay. Always interesting talking to you, Andrew. Thanks for coming on.